Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at the one advisory that we have out for the state. This is up in the northeastern part of the Brooks Range. This does include the Dalton Highway and Adigan Pass, and it is a winter weather advisory out for blowing snow that will impact the Dalton Highway and Adigan Pass, especially areas further to the north. And this is going to be in effect until 5 a.m. on Sunday. Otherwise, we don't have quite advisory conditions down in south central Alaska, but we are going to get some weather returning to the area. It is a strong push from the south, so there is some warmer air. So even though some of the precipitation amounts are going to be high along the North Gulf Coast, much of the low-lying areas are going to be warm enough to have a mix of rain and snow. So we are expecting less than an inch of new accumulation, especially starting tomorrow afternoon, on Sunday afternoon through Monday midday. Then as we look up further to the north, the Susitna Valley is going to remain cold enough to actually see a fair amount of new snow accumulation for this time of year, where we're expecting 4 to 6 inches of new snow from areas around Talkeetna and further to the north and west, especially in the mountains around there. Some higher snow amounts in Hatcher Pass and up along the Talkeetna Mountains and into the Alaska Range further to the north. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we can see the system that's bringing that precipitation to south central Alaska coming up from south of Kodiak Island, pushing in some cloud cover that's going to continue to move further to the north throughout time. Looking out to the west, we can see another low out over the Bering Sea that is bringing in a frontal system slowly but surely closer towards the west coast of the state. Further out by Shemya area, we do have a system from the North Pacific approaching the western Aleutian Islands, bringing some cloud cover and another push of warm air from the south up towards the islands. And then out over the Panhandle area, the lack of cloud cover helping to indicate that we still have high pressure over the Panhandle area, helping to keep clear skies and no precipitation for the Panhandle at this time. As we look at the weather for the remainder of the day, we can see that 1035 millibar low out by the Panhandle area, helping to keep weather off to the south and west of the area, extending some of that over south central for now, but we do have that system out just south of the Gulf of Alaska coming up, bringing in some warmer air, already bringing rain to Kodiak Island. A little mix of rain and snow out ahead of that is still a little bit colder out ahead of this system. And then much of mainland Alaska, we have some cloud cover, but not a lot of activity in terms of precipitation. That's going to be true up along the Arctic coastline as well, with the exception of some stronger winds through the northeastern part of the Brooks Range, where we can expect some of those blowing snow conditions for areas in that northeast Brooks Range. Then we do have down the west coast, as we get by the YK Delta area, we are expecting to see some snow out ahead of the system that is out over the Bering as that one slowly pushes further to the east, starting to bring precipitation to that southwest coastline. Starting off as snow, but we do see some warmer air and some rain as we get a little bit further south towards the Alaska Peninsula. And then behind that cold front, as we would expect, some colder air coming in, transitioning the rain over to a rain and snow mix headed towards the Pribilof Islands and some lighter showers for the central Aleutians. And then south of the western Aleutian Islands, we do have a system approaching from the North Pacific that is starting to bring up some warmer air and rain closer towards the area. As we look into tonight, that system still not quite making it to the western Aleutians, bringing some rain further closer, but not quite there yet. And then we're going to have our frontal system that was out a little bit more in the central part of the Bering, starting to push more into the eastern portions of the Bering Sea, bringing some rain to the Alaska Peninsula with a rain-snow mix as we move up into areas along the southwest coastline and up into areas closer towards the Seward Peninsula as well, starting to transition back over to snow, a little bit colder out ahead of that. And then we do have some isolated areas of snow throughout the western and northern portions of the interior along the Arctic coastline, and still having those blowing snow conditions through that northeastern portion of the Brooks Range. As we look down into the Gulf area, we have our system that was pushing through, starting to bring precipitation to the Kenai Peninsula overnight tonight. That mix of rain and snow out ahead of it, and seeing snow for areas further north of the Kenai Peninsula into the Chugach Mountains. And then we have our high pressure sitting over the Panhandle, continuing to keep the area clear of precipitation through tonight. As we move into Sunday, high pressure remaining over the area, starting to get a little bit weaker, but still keeping showers at bay for the time being on Sunday. Looking a little bit to the west, we have our frontal system continuing to push into south central Alaska, bringing that rain-snow line along the North Gulf Coast and starting to bring some of those showers up further into the Susitna Valley, where it's cold enough to remain as snow. Behind the system, warmer air bringing rain to Kodiak Island, and then impacting with that system that was out over the Bering Sea, starting to see that frontal system pushing in over the west coast of the state, bringing snow to areas of southwest Alaska. Still warmer further to the south, a mix of rain and snow expected around Bristol Bay area. And then colder conditions out by the Norton Sound, seeing more snow in that location, and then lighter snow as we get up by the Kotzebue Sound area and northern portions of the interior. As we look out over the rest of the Bering Sea, we do have high pressure, weak, but still enough to keep out precipitation for the eastern Aleutian Islands. And then we have our system that was in the North Pacific finally starting to have an impact on the central and western Aleutians, bringing some rain to the area, and a little bit colder out by the Attu area, where we are seeing a mix of snow and rain out there. As we look into Monday, that low starting to break down, still bringing some showers out by the western Aleutians. A rain and snow mix is expected. A new system coming up from the North Pacific, bringing another round of warm air to the central and eastern Aleutian Islands, where we are expecting to see some rain. And then another system as well pushing in towards the Alaska Peninsula into Kodiak Island, and another round of rain for the North Gulf Coast. A little bit warmer this time, not expecting as much snow as we look up into the Susitna Valley. We are expecting that to be more of a mix of rain and snow as we push later into the day on Monday. And then we are going to have some rain for the Panhandle area as well. Finally, that high pressure that was dominating the area pushing off a little bit and retracting back into the North Pacific. And then out over mainland Alaska, we have a series of waves moving through that are going to bring some snow showers through areas throughout much of the eastern interior, and then up to the northwestern portion of mainland Alaska. Mix of snow and fog expected up there far to the north. As we look at our lows for tonight, we'll start in the Panhandle area, where we have temperatures dropping down into the mid-30s. Some locations nearest to the Gulf, and in more southern locations expected to be a little bit warmer, near 30 degrees. So look in south central Alaska, temperatures dropping down into the 20s for interior locations and upper 20s as we get closer towards the coastline. Valdez and Homer both dropping down to 29 degrees. Warmer for Kodiak, dropping down to 38 for Sunday morning. Up in the interior eastern locations are going to stay in the teens, while as we move further to the west, staying in the lower to mid-20s, with Galena dropping down to 24 degrees. As we move up further to the north in the teens through the Brooks Range, with the pass seeing 15 degrees, and then all the way down to 4 degrees, coldest in the state for Arctic Village. Right around 10 degrees for the eastern portions of the Arctic coastline, and then in the mid to upper teens as we move further to the west. Dropping down into Kotzebue Sound area, lower 20s are expected, mid 20s for the Norton Sound area, and then right around 30 degrees for the YK Delta area. Mid 30s expected for the Bristol Bay area, with Iliamna, King Salmon, and Dillingham all dropping to 34 degrees. So we move into the Alaska Peninsula, mid to upper 30s are expected, and then mid 30s for much of the Aleutian Islands, with 30 degrees expected low for St. Paul. Moving into Sunday afternoon, we do have temperatures getting up to right around 40 degrees for the Aleutians, mid 40s as we move into the Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay area, into the mid to upper 30s for the YK Delta, with Bethel getting up to 39 degrees. Around the Seward Peninsula, lower 30s are expected, and that includes 31 for Point Hope, Shishmaref, and for Kotzebue. And then as we move up to the Arctic coastline, we are expecting temperatures to get up into the mid to upper 20s, and then 30 degrees through the Brooks Range, and then down into the interior, up into the lower to mid 40s, with Fairbanks getting a little bit warmer, 46 degrees expected high, into the lower 40s for much of south central Alaska, and the mid 40s as we get along the coastline. And then down in southeast, we are expecting temperatures to get right at around 50 degrees for highs on Sunday. As we move into Monday morning, we are expecting temperatures to drop back into the mid to upper 30s for the Panhandle area, mid 30s for much of south central Alaska as well, a little bit colder in the more interior locations. In interior Alaska, we are expecting temperatures to drop down into the mid to upper 20s, and that's going to be true up into northern parts of the interior as well. And then as we get into the north slope coastline, we do have temperatures dropping down into the teens, down into the mid-20s for the Kotzebue Sound area, upper 20s for the Norton Sound area, and upper 20s to right around 30 for the YK Delta area, with Antioch getting down to 30 degrees, mid-30s for the Bristol Bay area, and much of the Alaska Peninsula, then mid to upper 30s for the Aleutian Islands, with Adak getting down to 39 degrees for that low, and 29 degrees for St. Paul. So moving to Monday afternoon, temperatures getting back up into the lower 40s for the Aleutian Islands and the Bristol Bay area. Mid-30s for the YK Delta and Norton Sound area. Lower 30s for the Kotzebue Sound area. Mid-20s all along the Arctic coastline. Getting up into the lower 40s throughout the interior and mid-40s down in the south central area, with mid to upper 40s for the Panhandle.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with our flying weather on Sunday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread IFR conditions are expected, with some of those IFR conditions making it to the southwest coastline as well. MVFR conditions for the Alaska Peninsula and starting to make their way to the Kenai Peninsula. And then we do have some MVFR conditions up through much of the western portion of the mainland, to include the west coast and western interior. MVFR conditions expected for northern portions of the interior as well as the Brooks Range, and then along the western portions of the Arctic coastline. Down in the Panhandle area, we are expecting VFR conditions for Sunday morning. Those VFR conditions in the Panhandle should last through Sunday afternoon as well. However, the MVFR conditions and IFR conditions are going to push further into south central Alaska, keeping much of the North Gulf Coast under IFR conditions as well as Kodiak Island. MVFR conditions expanding into the Copper River Basin and some isolated areas of MVFR throughout much of the interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, primarily VFR conditions are expected, but we will have some MVFR as we get further to the west. Down the west coast of the state, IFR conditions are expected from the Seward Peninsula area down through southwest Alaska and for much of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Then on Monday morning, going to continue to see a mix of MVFR and IFR conditions for the Bering and Aleutians, with IFR now widespread over much of mainland Alaska to include all of the west coast, southwest Alaska, much of south central, much of the interior, and the Arctic coastline. Down in the Panhandle, still protected for Monday morning, where we will still see primarily VFR conditions. However, there are some lower conditions approaching from the west and already making their way to Yakutat. By Monday afternoon, MVFR conditions will spread throughout the Panhandle area, with IFR conditions just over in the Gulf of Alaska and up by the Yakutat area. MVFR conditions for much of south central Alaska, and MVFR for the interior and west coast as well. Then some MVFR with isolated areas of IFR up along the Arctic coastline. Down in southwest Alaska, some areas of VFR conditions, but still primarily MVFR around much of the area. For the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, primarily IFR conditions will persist through Monday afternoon. As we look at our passes for Sunday, starting up north at AKwx, MVFR conditions should improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Adigan will be similar MVFR conditions in the morning, improving to VFR in the afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start off VFR and then drop down to IFR in the afternoon. Rainy Pass also going to start VFR and drop down to IFR conditions. Windy will start off VFR, only drop down to marginal conditions in the afternoon, as well as Isabel Pass, and then Mentasta will stay VFR throughout the day. Tenino Pass will start off VFR, drop down to marginal, and Portage will start off VFR, drop all the way down to IFR in the afternoon. Chilkoot and White will both be VFR throughout the day on Sunday. For a surface freezing level, we will see it riding through the Panhandle area up along the North Gulf Coast through southwest Alaska and then out into the central portions of the Bering Sea. An area of warmer air is coming up towards the Gulf of Alaska, with heights or freezing levels as high as 10,000 feet south of the Gulf, with the 2,000 foot freezing level moving through the Panhandle area and through much of the northern part of the Gulf of Alaska. For our icing, starting out way out west by the western Aleutians, below or between 1,000 and 5,000 feet is expected. Then areas of icing around the Alaska Peninsula and southwest Alaska above 2,000 feet, above 3,000 feet for south central, and above 5,000 feet as we get further up north in the state, along much of the Seward Peninsula area and much of the interior. Between 5,000 and 10,000 feet is expected over the Panhandle. For our jet stream, strongest area of jet over our area is going to be over the Alaska Peninsula, southwesterly flow around 95 knots, dropping down over south central to around 80 knots, and then 75 knots near the Panhandle. Northern portions of the state still going to see westerly flow, quite a bit weaker though, only around 45 to 50 knots, and then 65 knots out of the west over the Bering. As we drop down to 9,000 feet, we'll look at some winds out over by the western Aleutians out of a southeasterly flow, around 45 knots, diminishing pretty quick as we move to the eastern Aleutian Islands, and then southerly flow over much of the western part of the state around 30 knots, 40 knots out of the southwest over Kodiak Island, another stronger area of winds 30 knots out of the south over the Copper River Basin, and then along the Arctic coastline westerly winds 25 to 30 knots with weak flow out over the Panhandle. Down to 3,000 feet, still weak flow over the Panhandle, but we have a stronger set of winds that are going to be about 35 knots, picking up to 55 knots out of the east over the south central area, and then becoming more southerly up by the Norton Sound area, 35 to 45 knots. Much of the interior is going to be a lot weaker, but as we get up to the Arctic coastline, out of a southwesterly flow, around 30 knots there. Out over the central and western Aleutian Islands, southeasterly winds 55 knots are expected. For turbulence all along much of the southwestern portion of the state and along the North Gulf Coast below 5,000 feet, up by the Seward Peninsula below 3,000 feet, and the central Aleutians below 3,000 feet is expected.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, joined once again by the science liaison of GINA, Eric Stevens. GINA, of course, is the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And GINA is all about satellites, and Eric is always here to tell some really cool stuff about satellites. Now, the last time you were here, we talked about how the weather satellites can see clouds and what's under the clouds, but you're telling me that satellites can do a lot more, even protect the general public with aviation safety information.
That's right. There's one particular aspect of satellites we're going to talk about today that might not be immediately obvious, and that is detecting things in the atmosphere that are not clouds, that are not snow, not rain, but rather a hazard that can happen here in Alaska, and that is volcanic ash.
Of course.
When a volcano goes off, puts ash in the air, this is of course, a hazard to the public if the ash were to fall on the ground in accumulating amounts.
Sure.
Additionally, while the ash is in the air, and this is the more frequent hazard, is it's a hazard to aviation because you cannot fly an airplane into volcanic ash without great risk. Worst case scenario, the ash gets into a jet engine, wrecks the engine, kills the engine, and now you have an airplane flying with no engines. It won't fly for long. So aviators need to avoid that ash. How do you avoid the ash? You have to know where it is by identifying it with a satellite image and perhaps predicting then where the ash will flow with the overall weather patterns. Satellites are so important for identifying when a volcano goes off and then tracking the ash after the volcano injects the ash into the atmosphere.
Now, are you talking about seeing the heat signature or a huge volcanic plume with a cloud that we're used to seeing in the really pretty pictures of any Alaska volcano that's erupted recently, Redoubt, for example? Or are we talking about the really fine details? Because this is polar orbiting satellites, the ones that are very low to the ground, right?
The geostationary satellites can do some detection. The polar orbiters, like you say, they're closer to the Earth. They give the even better view. In answer to your question, I would say all of the above.
Oh, okay.
A heat signature from a volcano going off with all the heat that comes with the eruption, that can be identified in infrared imagery.
Okay.
We've got images from the Kamchatka Peninsula. That's the far eastern part of Russia on the western side of the Bering Sea, loaded with volcanoes.
Right.
You know, Alaska has plenty of volcanoes of its own. We can also be affected when a volcano goes off in Kamchatka, say, and then the weather carries that ash toward Alaska from the west.
Right.
You can see the infrared heat signature, like you say. Also, the ash in the air can be detected by doing some sophisticated channel differencing within the satellite data. You can find the identification of sulfur dioxide, say, that's a component of the volcanic emission, and you can trace this with the satellite imagery. Sometimes volcanoes go off that haven't gone off before, and we're not expecting them to go off. Say if there's no seismometers around a given volcano that hasn't gone off in 100 years, you might not be expecting it to go off in the satellite imagery. Since satellites can be globally comprehensive, that might be the first sign that you have that a volcano in an unexpected area is going off.
So it's a good backup system. Okay.
Right.
Wow.
Right. And people are working all the time on automating the interrogation of satellite data by computers to provide a first alert to a human, so the software will say, we think this might be important. Human, go take a closer look. Because the people are still the best way to interrogate the imagery, but the planet's a big place, and we can't be looking everywhere all the time, so the software helps give a first cut. And then in Alaska, there's a special kind of surprise angle where the satellites are helpful, and that is the Katmai eruption of 1912. huge eruption. There is still somewhat of a moonscape out there in southwest Alaska where all this ash is laying on the ground. And sometimes a strong weather pattern comes along where we have roaring northwest winds that go across the Alaska Peninsula there and can actually pick some of this ash up off the ground. No volcano is going off. This was more than 100 years ago that volcano actually blew. So you're not going to see a heat signature like we were discussing. There will be no seismic signature of a volcano going off. So those data sets, they'll say, oh, no problem. But you can see in some of the satellite imagery this ash, as it's called, resuspended. When the wind comes along, picks it up, the ash can be lofted a few thousand feet in the air just with the wind. And an airplane flying into that plume is exposed to some danger. So we need to track that ash to provide guidance to aviators that you don't want to be flying here at these elevations in this area. We've got some imagery of the resuspension, and you can see the wind blowing strongly from the northwest, picking up the ash and blowing it down to the southeast. And so that's another, perhaps not immediately obvious hazard of volcanic ash. Katmai is the gift that keeps on giving, for sure.
Very good. So we've got satellites that can help us understand the weather from the past and the immediate past. And we talked last time about how that's feeding into the forecast modeling to help improve predictions. But now they're also protecting the general public with aviation-sensitive information and watching volcanoes, whether they're erupting or maybe have erupted in the past, and finding the left-behinds from those volcanic events there. So really impressive stuff. Eric, thanks so much for joining us again today. And you're a gift that keeps on giving from the satellite community, so thanks a lot, and we hope to have you back again soon. Again, Eric Stevens with Dehne at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And if you'd like to check out any of the information that Eric has shared with us again today, you can do that very easily by going to www.dehne.alaska.edu. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section. We'll take a quick look at our ice edge. We do still have some ice in Bristol Bay, but as we have southerly winds coming up to the end of the weekend and into early next week, we are expecting some of the warmer air with those southerly winds to help to start to melt some of that Bristol Bay ice. And further up north, we do still see some polynyas on the north-facing coastlines, as we do have those southerly winds helping to create those polynyas on some of the islands and along some of the shores of like Norton Sound on the north side of those coastlines. As we look into southeast Alaska for Sunday, inside waters, we have easterly flow 5 to 10 knots, and then out over the Gulf, we have weaker winds in the south at 10 knots out of the southeast, and then getting up to as high as 20 to 30 knots as we get further to the north. As we look on Monday in the inside waters, southeasterly winds 10 to 15 knots. Out over the Gulf, southerly winds 15 to 20 knots, getting up to as high as 25 knots and becoming more easterly as we get further to the north. For Sunday for south central Alaska, starting out in the northern parts of the Gulf, easterly winds 30 knots, getting up to as high as 40 knots as we get closer towards the Barren Islands, and then out in Prince William Sound, northeasterly winds 20 knots there. In Cook Inlet, northerly flow 25 to 30 knots, and that's going to continue down by Kamishak Bay as well. Moving into Monday in Cook Inlet, southerly winds around 10 knots, and west of the Barren Islands, northwesterly winds 20 knots, east of the Barren Islands, easterly flow 20 knots. Then out over the northern part of the Gulf, easterly winds 25 to 30 knots, and that's going to be true in Prince William Sound as well. Highest seas are going to be 7 to 8 feet in the northern portions of the Gulf. For Sunday for the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, Shelikof Strait has northeasterly winds 30 knots, then southerly winds on the south side of Kodiak Island around 20 knots there. Southwesterly flow by the peninsula around 20 knots, then easterly flow in Bristol Bay at 25 knots. On Monday, flow becoming much more northeasterly throughout all of the area. 15 to 20 knots is expected, with seas as high as 6 to 7 feet, highest on the Pacific side. As you look out over the Aleutian Islands, most areas are going to see an easterly wind, 20 to 30 knots, strongest as we get further to the west. However, as we get by the eastern Aleutian Islands, we are expecting winds out of the west at 15 knots, seas as high as 13 feet, highest as we get further to the west. Then on Monday, flow becoming more uniformly easterly, 25 to 30 knots for the central and eastern Aleutians, dropping down to 15 to 20 out of the northeast for the western Aleutian Islands, seas as high as 15 feet on the Pacific side of the eastern or central Aleutians. Along the west coast of the state, We do have winds out of the east to southeast, 15 to 25 knots, strongest south of Nunavik Island. Flow by St. Matthew Island out of the west at 15 knots, and then easterly winds by the Pribilof Islands at 10 knots. For Monday, starting up north, we have westerly winds 10 to 15 knots. And then as we move closer towards Nunavik Island, we have northerly winds 10 to 15 knots. Out by St. Matthew Island, east flow at 15 knots, and then easterly winds at 20 knots for the Pribilof Islands. Seas as high as 5 feet, highest by the Pribilof Islands. Along the Arctic coastline, southwesterly winds 15 knots as we drop down the west coast of the state, becoming more southerly and eventually more easterly, 15 to 20 knots, highest by the Bering Strait. Then on Monday, staying up north, we do have 5 to 10 knots out of a south to east direction, and more northerly flow along the west coast, 10 to 15 knots there, becoming westerly by the Bering Strait. Quick recap for our weather for tonight. We do have frontal system approaching the western Aleutians, bringing some warmer air and rain closer to the islands, but not going to make it there for tonight. Frontal system out over the Bering, slowly pushing to the east, bringing a mix of rain and snow to the southwest coastline, with snow further to the north, pushing up into the Seward Peninsula area, with some lighter showers for northern portions of the interior and on the northwest coastline. We do have blowing snow conditions for the northeastern part of the Brooks Range, including the Dalton Highway and through Adigan Pass. We do have a winter weather advisory out for blowing snow for that location until 5 a.m. on Sunday. As we look further to the south, we have a frontal system pushing into the Gulf of Alaska, bringing rain to Kodiak Island and a mix of rain and snow to the Kenai Peninsula. Snow further to the north as northern locations are holding on to the cold air a little bit longer, and then high pressure is dominating the Panhandle area, keeping precipitation out over the Gulf. As we move into Sunday, high pressure over the Panhandle will remain, but our frontal system out over the Gulf is going to continue to bring precipitation to areas around the North Gulf Coast. Primarily going to see rain at those lower elevations by the coastline, but more snow as we get to more interior locations, and expecting 4 to 6 inches of snow in northern portions of the Susitna Valley later on Sunday into Monday. All along the west coast, we are going to see some snow getting lighter as we get towards the Kotzebue Sound area and northern portions of the interior. And then we have our frontal system that was south of the Aleutian Islands starting to bring rain and rain-snow mix to the central and western Aleutians later on Sunday. Expecting that to continue to push in as we move throughout the day on Sunday.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.